Hi everyone, welcome to the Autism Understanding Scotland's How to Have a Good Reasonable Adjustments meeting webinar. Now you might notice that this is a little bit different from whenever we held it live. That's because we've had to re-record the webinar since the last recording didn't work so well. So if you're watching this again, having been at the webinar, please know that we might have slightly different information, but it'll largely be the same. So as with any webinar that I go to, I always want to know, who are these people? Why should I be listening to them? So my name is Marion McLaughlin. I am the CEO at Autism Understanding Scotland. My background's in education. I'm a qualified primary school teacher. I'm one of the spokespersons for the Scottish Government Different Minds campaign, and I'm the parent of an autistic child, as well as being late diagnosed autistic myself. It's just over 6 years now since I found out I'm autistic. Flick, who are you?
So I am Flick, otherwise known as Felicity Goodall, and I am the Senior Autism Practitioner at Autism Understanding Scotland. I am also a parent to 2 autistic children and late diagnosed autistic myself. It's just gone 2 years since I had my formal recognition. I am a former English tutor, and I was also one of the co-chairs on the Aberdeenshire Autism Strategy Planning Group as well. Oh, you're muted, Marion. Okay.
So what are we going to have a look at today then? So we're going to learn about what are your autistic rights, and have a look at some reasonable adjustment examples, because reasonable adjustments are an autistic right. So what even can a reasonable adjustment be? We're going to talk about good practice before, during, and after meetings. And there are steps that you can take before, during, and after to ensure that the meeting goes well and that everybody achieves what they're looking for. And hopefully, after you've finished this webinar today, you'll feel a lot more equipped for going into your next meeting. But first and foremost, Flick.
So we really kind of want everyone to consider the fact that while, yes, occasionally it might be the case that somebody doesn't want what's best for the autistic person, by and large, everybody around the table actually does want what's best for the autistic individual concerned. Now, sometimes different people can have different and maybe even conflicting understandings of what autism is, what autistic needs are. So sometimes that can definitely cause some conflict, but we would always recommend, if you're in doubt at all, then you need to check on good quality pages. So, you know, we fed into the NHS Inform page, for instance. It's much more up to date than a lot of the other sort of medical pages out there when it comes to autism information. But obviously you can always check our website as well, the Autism Understanding Scotland website, for up-to-date, good quality information about autism, about what it is, and what our needs can be as well.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes it takes time for people to sort of develop their understanding of autism, but it's good to bear that in mind whenever you're going into any meeting. Autism is a disability. One of the reasons why we have access to reasonable adjustments is because autism is viewed as a disability in law. And disability isn't a bad word. I think a lot of people, whenever they hear the word disability, we get head tilts, people feeling sorry for us, and it's not something that everyone is particularly comfortable with. But disability is not a bad word. It's not the end of the world to be disabled. It's not a tragedy to be disabled. Many autistic people are disabled by living in a world that is not designed for us. So it's not that autism and being autistic itself is inherently disabling. It's that the world is not designed to meet our sensory needs, to meet our communication needs, to work with our culture. The world isn't necessarily set up to recognize and support and appreciate that we're autistic and all the things that brings, the positive and the negative aspects as well. So that's what a lot of people describe as the social model of disability, where there's nothing wrong with being autistic, there's nothing wrong with being disabled, but there's something very wrong with trying to operate in a world that is not designed to support disabled people. And I think that this graphic that goes along really does do a very good job of representing the reality of being disabled in an ableist world, where everybody has supports that really work for them, but you don't necessarily have supports that work for you. And people have talked a lot about equality in the past, where everyone gets the same kind of thing. But the things that I need are very different to the things that Felicity needs an awful lot of the time, or a lot of other different autistic people. So we really need to be looking at the individual person and what is it that they need, and then giving them what it is that they need. But ideally, that would be equity, but ideally we would be removing those systemic barriers in the first place, so that the environments that we're in, the ethos of the environments that we're in, already support us as we are, recognize us, value us as we are. And yes, being autistic is classed as having a disability in law, but one of the things that we do sometimes get asked about, and we did get asked about whenever we're talking about the webinar, do you need a formal assessment? Do you need a formal diagnosis in order to access reasonable adjustments? And the answer to that is no, you don't. Reasonable adjustments are based on need, not your diagnosis, and self-identification is perfectly valid. There are lots of reasons why some people struggle to access a diagnosis, or there are some reasons why people might be able to access an assessment and a diagnosis, but choose not to. There's very good reasons why some people might not do that. So you should not require having a diagnosis in order to access reasonable adjustments. Is that fair, Flick? Have I missed out anything there?
No, I think that's all okay. Yeah. Okay, so we will have a quick look at what disabled people's rights in the UK actually are as well. So there are a few different pieces of legislation that cover us. One of those is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this is not a big, full description of what that actually contains. You can go and check it out for yourself, because there's a lot in there, but we've taken out some of those key points that really are relevant for what we're talking about today. So one of those is that we have the right to freedom from discrimination. And that can be in a whole host of different settings, in terms of, children, which obviously includes disabled children. So, that's within education, but that's also within the wider society as well, that they shouldn't be discriminated against. And that includes direct discrimination. It also includes indirect discrimination and things as well. The rights as well that they have are that anything that's done needs to be in the best interests of the child. Now, obviously, what's in the best interests of an autistic child is likely to be very different to what is in the best interest of a non-autistic child. So that is actually recognized here within the UNCRC. Also, autistic children have the right to effective access to education. And again, what makes education accessible for autistic kids and what makes education accessible for other children, likely to be two very different things. So yeah, it's making sure that it's accessible for the individual, and that can involve a whole host of different things. And we will look at a load of reasonable adjustments later, what that might actually look like in practice. But we also have the right to respect for the views of the child. So it's not enough that the adults all decide what is best for this child and it's done to the child. That child actually needs to be listened to as well, and their own views in law need to be respected. And that's really important, isn't it, Marion?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that happens to disabled people quite a lot. Non-disabled people will make decisions for us, and then we're expected to rubber stamp those decisions. Definitely never should be the case. And whenever it comes to children, their views really have to be taken into consideration. First and foremost, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And a lot of the time they're a lot more capable than maybe people realize.
I would definitely concur with that for sure. Yeah. With the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we have the freedom from discrimination again as one of our rights, as it should be. But we also have the right to full and effective participation in society. And again, as Flip said, that's not just education, that's not just work, this is wider society as well. And I do love this respect for the evolving capacities of disabled people. I think it's very easy for a lot of us who are parents of disabled children to find it hard to envisage what it's going to look like whenever they grow up. You know, that they're going to be able to do more and they're going to develop skills, and that they won't be the same person as they were whenever they're 5 as they were when they were 3, and then they're going to be different again at 15 and 25. Absolutely. But as a disabled person as well, what we're capable of one day is not necessarily reflective of what we're capable of the next, especially if we take into consideration things like burnout, things like meltdowns, like mental health difficulties, CPTSD, trauma. So that respect for the evolving capacities of disabled people, which means that the support that we get needs to be really fluid, and it's got to match where the person is at that particular time, rather than what's easy to put into place and what they usually need. And right to an accessible environment to work and learn in. And again, what's accessible for one person is not necessarily going to be accessible for the next. And we do need to keep on thinking, is this accessible today compared with yesterday, since their needs have changed? We were talking earlier on our social media about how accessible isn't necessarily an end destination. It's a journey, it's a goal, but because our needs evolve, then what is accessible might be evolving as well for that particular place. So that's constantly sort of reviewing and checking in. Is this still accessible now? Have your needs changed? Has your profile changed as well? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. Okay, and then that other piece of legislation we have in the UK that is really good in terms of our rights is the Equality Act 2010. So the Equality Act enshrines in law that we have a right to reasonable adjustments, and we're going to give a much bigger overview of what reasonable adjustments can be, what they can't be, give a load of example reasonable adjustments and things later on in the webinar, but we do have that right to them. And as Marion said earlier as well, that's based on need, that's not based on diagnosis. Also, as part of the Equality Act, we have the right to have information presented in an accessible way for us too. So that, again, will vary vastly from individual to individual, whether that means having information that is presented in more depth than for other people because we have more questions, you know, we need bigger paragraphs, we need all of the information, or whether it's perhaps in an easy read format, whether it's using pictures, whether it's sort of chunked up. There are loads of different ways that information might be presented, but it needs to be accessible for the individual and their specific needs and requirements. The Equality Act also recognises intersectionality, which is really, really important, because the thing is, if you belong to a few different groups, that mean that perhaps actually you are going to have certain barriers in place within society. So, you know, whether that means that you are disabled, whether or not that means that perhaps you're a woman, whether it means that you're part of the LGBT plus community, whether it means that you're from an ethnic minority, you know, any of these things, when you belong to more than one of those groups, will then interact, and actually the barriers that you might be facing as an individual kind of stack, if you like, and the way that other people are likely to treat you, the way that you might be viewed within society could be very different from somebody who only belongs to one of those different groups. And the Equality Act recognises that, which is really, really key, actually, because we know from you know, we have a really good relationship with the people at SEMA, which is Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics, and you know, they, for instance, will talk about their experiences of being Black and autistic, or being Muslim and autistic, and that's very different. You know, that can be very different from being white and autistic, you know, from being Christian and autistic. It's a different experience, and there are a different set of challenges that might go along with that, a different set of discriminations that you might face as well from other people. So recognizing that different people are going to need different things based on the fact that they might belong to lots of different groups, or at least more than one, is really key as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't really think that that can be overstated, Hannah. I think that that's something that people need to be talking about more and more and more all the time. And really having a look at who are you learning about autism from? And it really definitely needs to be from a wide variety of autistic advocates, I think. Yeah. Yeah. The Equality Act has a few more things in it, which we think is really important, especially for parents of autistic children whenever they're going in, or advocates who are supporting people. You cannot be discriminated against for being disabled, which we know that's quite widely covered. And that can be direct discrimination. No, you're not getting the job because we don't think that you're capable of it because you're autistic, would be very direct. But indirect discrimination can be, well, we have a policy that everybody has to do this exact same thing, which might be a barrier to accessing work or education for you. So you can't be discriminated against for being disabled either directly or indirectly. You also can't be discriminated against for being thought to be disabled. So even if you haven't disclosed that you have a disability, if they suspect that you're disabled, then you can't be denied opportunities purely on their beliefs, their suppositions. And you also can't be discriminated against for being associated with a disabled person. So if you are, for example, a parent who's going in to have a reasonable adjustments meeting about your child with the school, then you can't be discriminated against for being associated with your child as well. So it's really important to bear in mind that the Equality Act doesn't just cover people who are disabled, or other minorities, but also for being thought to belong to that minority group or being associated with that minority group too. So really important to bear that in mind whenever you're going along to meetings as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thinking a bit more about reasonable adjustments, we're going to have a little look at what reasonable adjustments can actually do. So one of the things that reasonable adjustment can do is to support a child or someone who is qualified for a role with, and all of these different things. So with their sensory needs, for instance, and again, we will look at loads of examples of these a bit later on. So yeah, it might be sort of making sure that an environment is accessible for them because they are getting their sensory needs met. It can also mean that they are making sure that they are keeping regulated from both a sensory point of view and also an emotional point of view. And we know that that emotional regulation and that sensory regulation for autistic people really, really closely bound up. So quite often one will massively affect the other. So it's really important actually to kind of remember that, and to think about that duality there, and how you can make sure that you're staying regulated with both, because that is something that a reasonable adjustment can absolutely help with. Another thing that reasonable adjustments can help with is autistic communication. So we know that autistic people communicate in a fundamentally different way to non-autistic people. It's not that we're poor communicators, it's just that we have a really different style of communication. However, because we communicate in a minority way, because our way of communicating is different from a lot of other people, that can end up kind of getting us discriminated against. It can mean that we end up with barriers in terms of understanding information, in terms of communicating with people in school and work, at the doctor's surgery, in loads of different areas. So a reasonable adjustment can absolutely support us with that difference in communication. Another thing that it can do is reduce the risk of burnout. Now, autistic burnout is there's a long-term crisis point. We did our masking and burnout webinar recently, that always goes down a storm. But yeah, autistic burnout, really, really bad long-term crisis point for autistic people. That's really bad for our mental health. And so making sure that we're reducing the risk of that as much as possible is absolutely huge. And a lot of the time, all reasonable adjustments that can be put into place will actually go some way towards reducing the risk of burnout, because burnout can come from our needs not being met in a whole variety of different ways. But there can sometimes be specific reasonable adjustments put into place that are really there to tackle that risk that we might be at of reaching autistic burnout. Reasonable adjustments can also help with executive functioning as well. And executive functioning is that thing where we can kind of recognize that there's a task that needs to be done. We sort of think about the different steps that are required in order to actually do the task, the order that those steps need to be done in. We're then able to start the task, do each step in the right order, and complete it at the end, which is almost everything, you know, that encompasses so much of what we do in our day-to-day life. So yeah, sort of helping autistic people to learn to carry out those tasks, to be organized, that can be a big part of what reasonable adjustments are actually doing as well, so that we're able to do those tasks in the same way that our peers would be able to, so that we're having the same access to that as anybody else. Reasonable adjustments can also help with avoiding information overload on the one hand, you know, getting too much information at one time, being given information in a way that overwhelms us, makes it difficult for us to process it, but also avoiding information underload as well, because sometimes we need more information. We might have more questions than our peers. We might need more detail than other people do. So at either end, reasonable adjustments can help with basically making sure that the amount of information that we're getting and the way we're getting it is appropriate and accessible for us. Isn't that right?
I think I'm always the person who's looking for more information. So people give me a pile of information, I'll have a read through it, and it's like, I have questions straight away.
I need more.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, additional.
Yeah.
Yeah. What can reasonable adjustments not do though? So reasonable adjustments can't make you any less, you know, disabled. You know, like any innate disabledness that you might have. It doesn't. A reasonable adjustment doesn't stop you being disabled in the eyes of the law. So it's not to sort of negate that lived experience. It's to recognize and support that experience. They can't be unaffordable. So, for example, a school building might not be as accessible as it could be, but we can't necessarily knock down school and then start all over again. They have to be practical to implement. So if you are working in a listed building, then it might not be possible to be putting in elevators. It might be possible for them to put in stair lifts and other things that would be useful. But it needs to be something that's practical to be putting in and has to be affordable. Now, a reasonable adjustment shouldn't be making you force yourself to mask and present neurotypically. Reasonable adjustments should be about supporting you as a disabled person, working with your disability, rather than squashing that disability and making you hide it. Autistic people will never not be autistic. And I often talk about growing into being autistic rather than growing out of being autistic. You're never going to grow out of being autistic. That's not a reasonable expectation. And you can't suddenly expect that if we give this autistic person lots of access to the sensory input, they'll eventually just get used to it. That's not a reasonable adjustment. That's forcing us to mask and act as if that doesn't actually bother us. If noise bothers somebody, then it's always going to. So if noise upsets someone, then how do you manage that environment rather than how do you get the autistic person or the otherwise disabled person to suppress that? Can't be an adjustment for something that's not a disability. So, for example, covering up non-medical tattoos. So if you are working somewhere and you're not allowed to show any tattoos unless it's a medical tattoo, then you can't be asking for them to get the adjustment in for them to pay to cover up any tattoos, or that would have to be your role. And it can't put an unqualified person in a job role. So, for example, if you are going for a job, you have to be able to meet the minimum qualifications and you have to be able to meet the core tasks of that particular job. So, for example, if you wanted to work for a newspaper as a journalist, then you would still have to meet the deadlines, because that would be an expected core part of the role, being able to work to a tight time frame. Whereas in other roles, you might be able to get extensions on tasks from time to time, but that would be very, very much dependent on the job role and what your core tasks are. So it can't be putting you into a role if you're not qualified for it, or if you can't meet those core requirements for that particular role. Anything I've missed there?
No, I think you covered everything for that one. Okay, so we're going to have a little think about who can actually suggest reasonable adjustments. And I do want to stress here that while, you know, any one of these people can suggest a reasonable adjustment, that doesn't mean that it automatically has to be put into place, because it does need to actually work for the autistic individual. Now, first and foremost, obviously, most important person that should be listened to in all of this, and if they are able to come up with suggestions, you know, should be allowed to do so, though certainly that emotional work shouldn't be expected to be done solely by this person, is the autistic individual themselves. So, you know, an autistic kid at school, if they have ideas of what can be put into place to make school more accessible for them, then that should be the starting point. If an autistic person at work has suggestions for how work can be more accessible for them, then yeah, that's absolutely the place to start as well. And the same for, you know, an autistic individual who is maybe struggling to access going to the GP, or something like this, or, you know, getting to their local library and things like that. They can be suggesting reasonable adjustments to help them access any of these things, to help them to actually meet the requirements and have all of the same opportunities as their peers. But there are some other people as well who can absolutely make suggestions for reasonable adjustments. So quite often family, so, you know, that might be parents of an autistic child, but also other family members, and that includes, you know, even if you have an autistic adult as well, and a family member goes along as a supporter in a reasonable adjustments meeting, then they can also be suggesting certain reasonable adjustments too. You know, sometimes the autistic individual themselves might not feel comfortable voicing some of these things too, so it might be that their best advocate in that case, you know, will be a family member who knows them really well and can make suggestions that's going to help there. When it comes to things like work, people like line managers can suggest reasonable adjustments, also HR can as well. You know, it's basically, again, anybody who knows that the individual needs those reasonable adjustments, and it is medical grade information that you are autistic, so this information should only ever be shared with your express consent. But yeah, if people know, then yeah, that's good, they can make those suggestions. EDI groups as well, so that's equality and what
Diversity and inclusion.
Yes, equality, diversity, and inclusion groups.
DEI groups, diversity, equality, and inclusion. So different organizations have different, but if it deals with equality or equity, as some of them are moving to now as well, diversity and inclusion, yeah, they might have different names. Yeah. Sorry, Flick.
That's all right. I suddenly thought, I was like, oh wait, I had made an effort to remember this and now it's gone out of my head. So if you do have an EDI group as well set up, to kind of have a little think about making sure that the place is accessible and it is actually sort of covering everybody's rights and making sure that everybody belonging to all sorts of different groups are getting what they needed and are getting treated fairly. If they're coming up with suggestions, then that's another one where you could be getting suggestions for reasonable adjustments as well. OTs, so that's occupational therapists, can, psychology as well, also autism assessors could be the ones. So, you know, when you actually go for your assessment, they could be giving suggestions as well as to what they think is going to be helping. You could get a workplace needs assessment as well, which would really look at what you actually need in terms of making your job accessible for you, making sure that you are able to carry out all of those core requirements for your job, and that it's not going to be more of a burden for you than for other people at your work as well. And Access to Work, which is a government scheme. So they can be contacted when you start a job. If you contact them within the first 6 weeks of starting a new job, depending on the size of the company, they will actually cover a lot more of the costs as well. So you can contact them at any time, but doing it within those first 6 weeks is really key, because that way you can save the company a lot of money. So yeah, they can sometimes provide quite a lot of different things in terms of reasonable adjustments and in terms of various kind of pieces of assistive technology and equipment and things like that as well. So yeah, so you might have like your additional support needs departments and the like at schools as well, and they would be able to make suggestions too for reasonable adjustments that could be put into place. And also locally we have autism outreach as well. So I don't think that that's a national one, but that's I believe a kind of set of teachers who specialize in autism who can go into schools and also kind of make suggestions of how to best support autistic pupils and what sorts of reasonable adjustments can be put into place to make sure that their needs are being met. Is that right there? Did I miss anything out, Marion?
Yeah, Autism Outreach locally has got, I believe last time I checked, they've got some people support assistants as well. And Access to Work is completely free during the first 6 weeks. So in the first 6 weeks, it doesn't matter the size of the organization. Then you can get some support. They can, and then after that, depending on the size of the organization may have to fund a percentage, although it's a relatively low percentage. But then Access to Work covers the rest, and it is quite a big amount of money that you can get from them depending on what your needs are. But Access to Work can also help out if you're going for a job interview. So if you're going for a job interview and you need some support, then they can be worth contacting as well. So a few different places that I think can really help. So we're on to example reasonable adjustments after about half an hour or so. We're finally there. Okay. So what can some example reasonable adjustments mean? Now remember, not every person will need all of these, and they're not going to work in every environment for every autistic person. But here are some ideas, so then people got a basis of what could potentially be a reasonable adjustment. Okay, noise cancelling headphones or earplugs can be really useful, especially in places like classrooms or open plan offices, or if you're working in the community. STEM tools, weighted blankets on lap whenever you're working at a desk. My desk is absolutely covered in fidget tools, STEM tools, that I use really, really regularly, and they help keep me regulated. They help me to focus, they help me to concentrate, they help me to remember things, they help memory recall, and also sometimes some of them are just fun, and that's okay too, because that helps us to stay emotionally regulated as well. Home working to control the sensory stimuli, and with some autistic people homeschooling, so still getting the work from the school, but being able to complete it in a at home where you have more control over the sensory environment. Having a separate office or a quiet area and shared office or classroom. Not everybody is going to be able to get their own office. As lovely as that would be for many of us, that's not always practical or reasonable to expect. But even having a quieter area that's designated as a quiet space can be handy. And a designated quiet space could be maybe a room that doesn't get used incredibly often. Some of the workplaces that I've visited recently have got well-being rooms, which is really, really good idea. And if that's not being used at any other point, then that's a place that could be accessed. If you've got a meeting room and that's not in use, then again, potentially that could be a quiet place. Any other area that can be comfortable for somebody to access where they can get a sensory break. Allowing for more frequent breaks. So that's not necessarily having more break time than anybody else. You just might need that break time more frequently. So rather than having one 20-minute break in the afternoon, maybe having 2 10-minute breaks in the afternoon, for example, might work a little bit better, or 4 or 5-minute breaks, depending on what it is that the autistic person needs. Working further away from toilets or the staff kitchen, with the best will in the world, these are not the most fragrant places always. I think that's a nice way to put it, right? And in some staff kitchens, if you've got someone who is microwaving fish, for example, I had a colleague who in the past who really couldn't stand the smell of egg. So as a reasonable adjustment, I would make sure that I just didn't eat any egg sandwiches around them. But in a larger office space, and a school environment, then that might not necessarily be practical, but being able to work further away from other people, or even having lunch in a separate area from others might be a reasonable adjustment too. Flexibility with uniforms. What actually needs to be in the uniform, and why does it need to be like that? So really having that thought and consideration about it. Now, some uniforms can really foster a sense of identity that you belong to a place, and with some uniforms it can also take out the hassle and the worry, what am I going to wear that particular day? But if that uniform is then a barrier to you accessing work or education, then it's not actually doing the job that you need it to. So one of the reasonable adjustments that we've helped some families to put into place has been children wearing dark coloured jogging trousers for going to school, black or grey jogging trousers, rather than having to wear a skirt or trousers, for example. Jogging trousers tend to have quite soft material on the inside, which can make it much, much, much more comfortable to be wearing, rather than stiff school trousers. So flexibility with uniforms can be an example of a sensory reasonable adjustment, can't it, Flip?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as somebody who often has different sensory needs in terms of clothing, that's one appreciated. We don't have a uniform at AU Scott, but we do make sure that everybody is very physically comfortable in what they're wearing. Okay,
comfort is our. Did we say comfort is our uniform? I would say that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. So moving on and thinking about some different executive functioning reasonable adjustments that could potentially be put in as well. So creating tools for employees to use can be really useful. So, maybe that's having a red box file with everything they need for something all in one place. Maybe that's something like an anxiety management tools as well. A lot of us kind of have those higher levels of anxiety, and in terms of our executive functioning, sometimes if we're less anxious, we're actually a lot better able to be kind of focusing on tasks and getting things done and everything as well. Sometimes having various visual tools can be really helpful, kind of visual cues for what it is that we're meant to be doing as well, so that we're not having to kind of keep it in our heads, but we've got things kind of at a glance that can be really helpful. Having visual work folders as well can be really useful, and breaking down those tasks, because if we're given just a big kind of like, right, you need to go and do X, and we're like, oh no, but what does that actually entail, and where do I start with that? That can be tricky. Whereas if we've got it broken down into, okay, so do X, which involves step 1, step 2, and step 3, that can be much easier then to get started, because we're like, right, we get started with step 1, that's brilliant, and then we move on to step 2, and it just keeps it much, much simpler and easier for us to follow through with that task and to remember the right order of it and everything. Might involve having a phone directory as well, so that we've got everything all in one place when it comes to those kind of phone numbers and things like that. So it could be lots of different visual aspects like that. But also making sure we've got a good structure to our day as well can be really helpful. Sometimes that can mean keeping the structure the same every day, so that we know exactly what to expect, so that when we are coming in the morning, we know that, right, okay, I always work on this first. So, you know, in a school, that could be, I know that I come in and I do maths first thing in the morning, and then I know that after that I move on to looking at some of the phonics stuff, and then I know that, you know, after break we move on to doing a bit of physical, you know, education or whatever. In a work situation as well, like much the same, you can have that kind of structure, like, okay, so first thing I do when I come in is I work on emails for half an hour, and then after that I move on to the next task. And you know, sometimes it's not possible for that structure to be kept the same every single day, but having some form of structure can really, really help us to know what to expect, to know what it is that we're going to be doing, so that reduces the anxiety as well, and we just feel a bit better able to get on with the task. Having detailed checklists for daily tasks can be good as well, because that can keep us on track. It can keep us on task, and it means as well that you get like a little dopamine kind of hit every time you can check off a task, which actually literally the chemicals that releases then in the brain puts you in a better place for starting the next task. And starting tasks can be really difficult for autistic people. That can be a big part of executive functioning. So allowing that, actually working with, you know, the brain chemistry, especially if we're like co-occurring also ADHD, if we're ODHDers, have that combined presentation, that can be really, really helpful. Sometimes it might involve just having one task to do at a time, so that instead of trying to keep 7 different tasks in our head, and you know, we're maybe already thinking about task number 5 whilst we're trying to do task 1, and then that's distracting, or maybe by the time we've finished task 2 we can't remember what task 3 was supposed to be. Just being given one thing to do, work our way through that, and then being given the next job, that can be really helpful as well. Having those daily tasks ordered in a way that limits the walking required between different workstations can be really helpful as well, because if you know, you're needing to be over here for doing this first part of a task, but then you need to walk all the way to the other end of the office or school or whatever in order to kind of get to the next part of that task, but then you're coming all the way back again, well, that means there's a lot more scope for distractions along the way. That means there's a lot more time for you to forget what the next part was that you were supposed to be doing. So yeah, in terms of executive functioning, ordering it in a really logical way so that you're not kind of constantly back and forth and all over the place and forgetting what you came to that station for, you know, that can be really, really useful as well. Having lots of visual aids too, for some people that can be really helpful. Other people might prefer it to be written information, but for some, having visual kind of cues can be really, really handy, so that we know what to expect and we can associate it with some sort of visual aid in some way. That can be really, really useful. Sometimes we might need a bit of extra time or support for learning new tasks. I know that I'm the kind of person who often initially I take a lot longer to get my head around something new when I'm having to learn it. Often I end up being faster than a lot of other people doing it once I've got to grips with it, but that initial learning period, because I maybe have more questions, because I maybe kind of struggle with remembering the order of all the steps required for that task, once I have it set in my brain, I'm good and I can be left to just get on with it and whiz through. But that initial part actually needs a little bit more time spent sometimes for me to feel comfortable and to know what I'm doing. Sometimes we might need extra time to read and complete certain tasks as well. Again, you know, that might not mean that we need extra time with everything, but specifically for reading maybe big long chunks where we're likely to kind of struggle and get lost in the middle of it, that might be really useful. Quite often physically being shown how to do something rather than just being told verbally is incredibly helpful, because I know that I process much, much better what it is I'm supposed to be doing if I can actually be shown how to do it, and I get the opportunity to complete the thing at the same time as well, whilst the person is perhaps, you know, showing me how to do it, rather than them just telling me and then expecting me to hold all of that in my head and to convert that verbal kind of instruction that I've been given into what visually needs to happen and what physically I'm supposed to be doing. So yeah, being literally shown how to do it can be really, really useful too. And also there's lots of assistive technology out there as well. It's worth exploring what's out there. The example that we've got there is a LiveScribe Echo Pen. So things like that can be really useful, but there's loads of tech out there. So also sort of checking in to see if anyone else has suggestions, you know, at your workplace can be really, or school can be really useful as well. Okay.
When I was teaching, I would very much have the my job, our job, your job. So if we were learning a new thing, it would be my job. I would be doing it completely by myself, and I would tell the children, kind of, oh, you're not allowed to help. No, this is my job. No, you can watch, but you're not helping, which they all thought was kind of funny. And it would be our job together. We would share it so that they have lots and lots of scaffolding and support and structure. And then it was their job to go off and do it. And I think that worked really, really well. And I think it does work really well for a lot of autistic people. So we can do a bit of observing, sharing and body doubling with each other, and then being able to go off and do it ourselves when we're ready. Yeah. And I love assistive tech. Some other practical supports, autism disability training for staff. And we would always recommend that if you're getting any kind of disability training, then make sure that it's by somebody who has that disability as well. Because there is absolutely no substitute for lived experience. So having a professional who specializes in that disability and is disabled themselves is one of the best options that we would argue there. Clear communication. Autistic people literally communicate in a different way to non-autistic people. And please do check out our webinar on autistic communication with Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics up on our YouTube page if you're interested in exploring more about communication. But have you literally said the words that this person needs in order to go ahead and do their task? Or have you implied something that you're expecting them to infer from? And check your assumptions on that one to make sure that they're right. A designated parking space can take away a lot of anxiety and worry. Whenever you're trying to negotiate a big parking lot and you don't know where you're going to be, or if your memory means that you're going to find it really difficult to remember where your car is parked, then knowing that you have a specific space that is yours that you can always use every day is going to make it a lot easier. I did have a job where I had a designated parking space, and I really appreciated that. And I like that I have one here as well. Adjusted start and finishing times. So a lot of autistic people do really struggle with sleep. Not all of us, but a lot of us do really, really struggle with sleeping. And sometimes sort of having an 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning start can be really difficult for some folks who are struggling with their sleep. So being able to start a bit later, but then finishing a little bit later can work really, really well for a lot of autistic folks. But conversely, some of us are early birds and might want to get started a little bit earlier on in the day. And again, I've had a couple of jobs in the past where I've been able to make my own hours. So decided I'm maybe going to start 7:30 till 3:30 that day if I've gotten up early, or 8 till 4 was our usual one. But in other jobs that might not be possible. For example, when I was a teacher, I had to be there for whenever the kids were in, and I had to stay until they left at the end of the day. But if it's possible, then adjusting those starting and finishing times can be really handy. And again, as an autistic person, it can be really hard to go into a busy area that's already got lots of people in it. So for some autistic people, getting to come in 10 minutes earlier, 5 minutes earlier than peers into a quiet classroom or into a quiet office before it starts to fill up might work really, really well and help to lower that anxiety. Allowed to work in a way that suits them and not as it has always been this way. I think that phrase, it's always been this way, just needs banished. I think we need to get rid of that phrase. That phrase doesn't do us any good as a community, I don't think at all. A lot of autistic people are absolutely brilliant at coming up with out-the-box solutions. So we can sometimes come up with really elegant ideas on how to tackle a problem that a lot of non-autistic people might not have noticed yet. And so allowing us to work in a way that's going to suit us, that might be a little bit more economical, that might be a little bit more efficient, and still gets the job done to the standard that you're looking for, can be really handy. No homework or an option to do homework at school if you absolutely have to do homework for whatever reason. For a lot of us, it's really handy to have this is the place that we do this in, and this is a place where we do that in, and the two don't meet. So you do school work at school, and you hang out at home and play video games and play with your friends and talk with your parents, and but there's no crossover between them. So if the autistic child is really, really struggling to do homework, if it's causing meltdowns, if it's causing distress, if it's something that they're just really struggling with, maybe no homework or an option to do homework at school could be an option instead. Access to a peer mentor can make a real big difference as well. I remember having a peer mentor in one of the jobs that I had previously, and it was an unofficial arrangement between us, but that peer mentor was able to speak with me whenever I was coming up with lesson plans. They were able to support me during staff supervision sessions. They were able to come in with me whenever I was having meetings with the boss. And it really, really did make a difference to my confidence and help me feel like I had somebody who was there like on my side. That really, really did help a huge amount. And some of the autistic children that we've supported have really benefited from both having access to a peer mentor, but also being a peer mentor as well, and having that responsibility that they're helping to look after maybe younger children who are possibly also autistic, but maybe don't know as much about what that means. So access to peer mentors or becoming a peer mentor can be really beneficial. And regular check-ins to ensure that needs are met. So you've got reasonable adjustments. They've been in place for a whole term or for a month. Are they working? Are they actually doing what you expected them to be doing? Have you got any other needs? And I know that for myself, whenever I became pregnant, my sensory needs changed wildly. Thanks to perimenopause and menopause, my sensory needs have changed quite wildly again. Are those needs the same? No. So then the reasonable adjustments need to be adjusted as well. So making sure that the things that you've got at that particular time are actually working for you. And if you're dipping in and out of burnout, if you're struggling physically or with any other co-occurring things that might be going on, then you need to be checking in and seeing, does anything need to be updated? Anything I've missed there, Flick?
No, I think that was all spot on.
Okay,
so we're actually we're getting towards the meeting, but we've got a few slides just covering the prep, before the meeting, the things that should be happening in the build up before we move on to the meeting itself. So first of all, the really key thing that needs to be asked before the meeting is, what does the autistic person want to get out of it? What are they actually looking to achieve here? Are they wanting to be better supported with their sensory needs? Is that the main thing that they want to achieve from that meeting? Are they wanting to be better supported because they think that they're heading towards autistic burnout? So what is the key thing that they are looking to get out of that meeting? And that should really be the focus of the meeting at that point, because there's no point having a meeting to do with reasonable adjustments if you end up discussing something that the autistic person never wanted in the first place. And occasionally we have come across schools and places like that where they've sort of had a standard, shall we say, set of, well, this is what we always do for our autistic pupils, and then they've been shocked that that's not worked for that particular autistic student, when that student was never asked whether those things would actually be helpful for them. So checking in with the autistic individual ahead of the meeting, what are you looking to get out of it? And then also, you should be asking for, or if you're the one kind of setting up the meeting, providing an agenda ahead of the meeting. So the agenda should be listing the topics that will be discussed during that meeting. And it is really important as well that all meeting participants should be able to contribute to the agenda ahead of time. And it's really useful then, because it means that there's not surprises coming up, because it's much easier to address things that are likely to come up in a meeting if everybody has the opportunity ahead of time to see what's going to be discussed and to think to themselves, right, well, what's my input in that? Is there an occupational therapist coming along to the meeting? Well, then it's really important that they know ahead of time that you're going to be discussing those sensory needs, so that they can be thinking about about that before they turn up, and they're not just put on the spot, you know? So it's not just the autistic individual who needs to know this stuff ahead of time, though obviously that is important. But yeah, it's helpful for everybody there to have an idea of what's going to be discussed before they actually go into that meeting. Should also be really clear on who's actually coming along to the meeting, and who's going to be chairing the meeting. So yeah, there shouldn't be surprise people turning up when you're in the meeting. I've been in a meeting before where a load of people turned up that I wasn't expecting, and it really put me on the back foot. Actually, it made that meeting incredibly uncomfortable for me. It meant that I wasn't in a good frame of mind for actually having that meeting. It really threw me. So making sure that everybody has an idea of who it is that's actually going to be turning up, who's attending it, is key, but also who's going to be chairing it. And yeah, the person who's chairing the meeting, and later on we'll get on to sort of talking about minutes as well, the person taking the minutes, those should be two separate people. We should also be clear ahead of time about when the meeting is going to be taking place, when it's going to be starting, and it is important that that happens promptly. So it needs to be scheduled at a time that everybody can actually be there for the start, and that, you know, people turn up and then they're sort of left waiting for half an hour before it actually begins. Again, that's going to have everyone feeling really dysregulated. That's not good. So everybody needs to be clear on what time they actually need to be there for the meeting and when it's going to finish, okay? Which sometimes means that you need to ensure sufficient time is given so that all the topics can actually be covered. And if you think that there's going to be too much for that one meeting, then schedule two separate ones, because it's really frustrating when you're expecting a meeting to end at a certain time and then it runs over because that wasn't actually enough time, or you get to the end and not everything has actually been covered. So yeah, sort of having a clear idea of the length of the meeting and making sure that everything that's needed to be discussed can fit within that meeting as well. And then also ensuring that the meeting environment is appropriate for everybody who's going to be attending. Now, obviously, yes, that means the autistic individual, their needs should definitely be considered, whether those are sensory needs, whether those are communication needs, but everybody else's needs are important as well. So it is making sure that that environment is going to work for everybody at the meeting. You don't know what is going on in somebody else's life, you know. You don't always know how many people in the meeting are autistic, because bosses can absolutely be autistic, teachers can be autistic as well. So making sure that the environment is going to work for everybody involved is really key as well, because again, that's making sure everyone's regulated, everybody's going in the best possible mindset, and that's going to benefit everybody within that meeting, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's so important. The more comfortable everyone is, the easier it is to contribute.
Yeah.
So more before the meeting. If needed or desire, arrange for an advocate or a supporter to attend, and you are entitled to have either of these coming along, or both if you would like. So an advocate is there to support the autistic person's rights and should follow the advocacy principles, standards and code of best practice. So really well worth having a look up there, the Scottish advocacy and standards, so that you know what it is that they should be adhering to. Now, unfortunately, access to advocates can vary wildly geographically. And in some areas, you can get access to an advocate quite quickly, but in other areas, there might be a bit of a waiting list, or they might be fully booked if there's not many of them and there's high demand. So the sooner you can request an advocate come and join you for a meeting, the more likely they are to be able to come along. And it's good to check in with the advocate in advance, so then they know exactly what it is that you're there for support. Now, a supporter can be a friend, family member, or from a charity or organisation that the autistic person is involved with. So they don't necessarily have to be an advocate, they don't necessarily have to adhere to those standards and codes of best practice, but they can maybe sort of talk about their experiences of working with that, of being involved with that particular person, or maybe talk about autism more widely, rather than sort of quite specific at times as well. Now, both can be asked to speak up on the person's behalf. And sometimes one of the handy things about having an advocate or a supporter along can be that they can take notes so that you can concentrate on the meeting. So you can be really focused on what it is that you're saying and listening to what the other people are saying back. But an advocate or a supporter can speak up if you get a little bit overwhelmed, if you're feeling a bit tongue-tied, if you just need a little bit of a break, they can be help out with that. But they can also sort of take some notes for you that you can both reflect on afterwards. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so last one before the meeting, before we're going into the meeting, I think. So consider sharing questions in advance so that the person who's going to be answering those questions has time to process and actually think about what answer they might give before the meeting, you know, because again, being prepared, it saves time in meetings. A lot of the time there's a lot to pack into these meetings, so it saves time if people have already had that ahead of it, but it also means that they're able to give better and fuller answers because they haven't been put on the spot as well. And again, it reduces the stress for everybody involved because they're going to be feeling more prepared as well. Check that everybody has the previous minutes as well. So everybody should be able to check back over what was discussed last time, what those actions were that were supposed to be, you know, put into place before the next meeting, but also any other relevant documents as well. You know, if you're going to be bringing in evidence from a speech and language therapist, then it's really helpful that report can maybe be seen by everybody as long as permission has been given and that's appropriate, you know, that everybody has been able to read it ahead of time. Again, saves time a lot of in a lot of cases when time is really precious in these meetings, and it just makes sure that everybody's feeling really prepared as well. It's a really good idea to sort of think about what you're going to need in a meeting and make sure you have it all with you as well when you're going into a meeting. Having water can be really, really useful because, you know, often it will be provided, often tea, coffee, water, or whatever will be provided when you're going to a meeting, but making sure ahead of time that you do have like a water bottle or something with you, because if you're going to be talking a lot, you can get a dry throat. It's really embarrassing if you have a tickly cough suddenly and you're and you just need to take a drink. So making sure you got that with you. I find as well that a lot of the rooms these meetings take place in are kind of air conditioned, and it can make the air really dry, so my lips end up quite dry. And again, if you're doing a lot of talking, so things like lip balm, just thinking about that for your own comfort. You know, are you going to need like fidget tools with you to keep you regulated, making sure you've got a notebook and a pen as well so that you can take notes as and when you need to, you know, so that you can remember things if somebody else is talking and you're like, oh, that's a really good point, actually I was going to mention something about that, but I need to remember that fact whilst also listening to the rest of what they're saying. Well, you can note it down if you've got a notebook and pen. And then ensuring downtime is available afterwards for anybody who might need it. Some of these meetings can be quite high energy. It's maybe a bit of a euphemism sometimes. You know, sometimes it can be outright stressful, and not having a break afterwards can be really hard. So, you know, sometimes that might mean scheduling the meeting so that it's at the end of the day, so that people are then actually getting to just go straight home afterwards. Sometimes that might mean scheduling the meeting so that it's just before lunch, so that people are able to go and get some food and have a break afterwards. Sometimes it means like allowing, you know, a pupil, if it's been a school meeting, just to go and have a bit of time out, you know, before they're expected to go back to a lesson. But also for, you know, the staff as well, for maybe teaching staff, and that again, they might not want to be sort of jumping straight back into teaching a class full of kids after one of these meetings as well. So it's thinking about everybody, thinking about their needs. You know, is it going to be most helpful for them to have the meeting right at the beginning of the day when everyone's feeling really fresh, or at the end of the day when everybody can go back home afterwards? It's gonna different sort of times are gonna suit different people and different kinds of meetings, but considering that when you're actually deciding when it's going to happen is also key to making sure that it goes really well. I think that's probably fair to say that.
Yeah, but I think sometimes even when a meeting goes really well, so it doesn't have to be bad meetings or difficult meetings that you might need downtime afterwards. If a meeting goes really well, especially if that's unexpected, then that can be dysregulating too. You know, dysregulation doesn't just happen when we feel bad emotions or negative emotions or strong emotions. Either positive or negative can evoke that dysregulation, can't it?
No, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
Right. During the meeting, so an hour in, here we go. We're finally got to the meeting. Introductions should be made where people haven't met previously. So if there's somebody new in the room, then make that. But I would say, as somebody who struggles to recognize people, even if I've seen them a few times previously, introductions is just a good idea anyway, regardless. And sometimes I do really benefit when people have like a name badge or a wee card in front of them with their name on it as well. So then you can remember who they are and where it is that they're from. Discuss minutes and progress from previous meeting if applicable. So if you had a meeting last month to discuss putting in reasonable adjustments, talk about, has it actually happened? Have these reasonable adjustments been put into place? Are you still waiting for your noise cancelling headphones to arrive, for example? Are you waiting on a report from occupational therapy? So what's been the progress from the last meeting? Have those agreed upon actions been actually put into place? Ensure that everyone has access to note-taking materials, but that someone has the role of taking the minutes to be distributed following the meeting. So any meeting that is being undertaken to discuss reasonable adjustments should be minuted. So then there's a paper trail that shows what was discussed by whom and when and what was agreed upon. And ideally, minutes should be taken by someone who is neutral. So it shouldn't necessarily be taken by another member of staff at a school, potentially, or somebody who's directly involved with working with a child. Minutes taken by somebody who doesn't work in your department, but can come in and take, maybe somebody from HR if you're not working in HR. And they should include all of the points made. So if you've brought up anything that you're concerned about and what you want done about it, then that should be minuted as well, even if nothing's been agreed upon for that particular point. Making sure that all those concerns are minuted and all the agreed upon actions are minuted as well. Ensure that you discuss how to support the autistic person with their strengths, as well as the areas in which they struggle. Well, we really are more than some of our difficulties, but a lot of reasonable adjustment meetings, that's largely the focus. Where do they struggle? What can we do to help? What can we all do collectively to help? But maybe a reasonable adjustment could be this child is excelling at playing the piano. So we're going to get them additional piano lessons, as well as they're maybe struggling with their maths a little bit, so we'll get them a maths tutor. I mean, if they do need to do their maths, that's fine, get the maths tutor, but also support them in the areas that they're doing really well. So it's not just about where we're struggling, but it's also about where we need help to succeed in other areas too. Maybe it could be about getting extra responsibility because we're doing so well in such an area as well. Anything you'd add, Flick?
No, I think that's brilliant there. Okay, so this one is specifically if the meeting is for an autistic child. It's really important to make the child feel welcome. And that can be done through, for instance, making sure that they're included in the introductions, you know, not just having all the adults in the room introducing, you know, themselves to each other over the child's head, and the child actually gets kind of ignored and left out of that. Make sure the child knows who everybody else is, but make sure you're introducing them to everyone as well. You know, yes, everybody will know that the meeting is about them, but actually they do need to feel like they are being included in that. It's really important. You shouldn't also be talking over the child or talking about them as if they're not there in front of you. I would hate to have that happen to me. And just because, you know, somebody is below the age of 18 or below the age of 16 doesn't mean that it's any less offensive for that to be done, you know, about them. So they should be included in these discussions. They shouldn't just be spoken about as if they're, I don't know, a chair, or as if they're not in the room at all, because that is really disrespectful and it's not okay to happen at all. So yeah, they really need to be taking a key role in all of this, and everything, you know, make sure that they are actually understanding what's being said, and it's not just a conversation that's going whizzing over their head, because, you know, they're the key person there. After all, they're the one who really matters, who's important in that meeting. making sure that they're comfortable in terms of, you know, do they need some fidget tools? Do they need any kind of other sensory accommodations? Do they need to have a comfort item in the meeting with them? So making sure that they've got anything like that to make sure that they're actually comfortable as well is really important. And then asking for their actual input throughout, you know, not just at the end as an afterthought. Oh, so did you have anything else to add, or what did you think about that, you know, said as you're all kind of leaving the room when clearly actually they're no longer able to input anything. No, they should be consulted all the way through. Now, for some kids, they might not want that level of attention on them, so this is maybe a discussion that needs to be had ahead of the meeting to make sure that is something that they're comfortable with. Obviously, it might be that they have, as Marion mentioned, an advocate with them to speak on their behalf, things like this, but it's really important to make sure that their input is getting put into the meeting and that their voice is getting heard there. And, you know, as part of that, the meeting really should be person-led rather than sort of person-centered, not person in the center. Because if somebody's in the middle and everybody around them is all looking at them, again, that's not a comfortable position to be in. And again, that's actually when you often get people talking over the top of them because they're there in the middle. Whereas if they're the one leading the discussion, if they're the one leading the meeting, if they're the one leading the reasonable adjustments that they want, that is the optimal position to be taking. Also consider who actually needs to be in the meeting so that it's not going to be overwhelming. Do you need several different people from the guidance department all in that meeting? Does every single teacher that child has need to be in that meeting? You know, just think about the people who really are key to what's being discussed, and just have them there so that it's not overwhelming, so that they don't feel like they're surrounded by a whole kind of crowd of adults all discussing them, because yeah, that's not nice for anybody. And also think about the fact that, you know, during COVID, a lot of these sort of school meetings ended up being held online in order to make sure that they could still go ahead, which was, you know, great and good, and for some people that made it easier for them to, you know, attend. You know, parents could attend meetings during their lunch breaks and things like that at work, and so some schools have continued to hold these meetings online for a whole host of reasons, which is fine. But if the meeting is being held online, so that child's parents are not there with them and they're attending, they are likely to feel a lot more vulnerable. They're likely to feel a lot more alone in that meeting, and that might be distressing for them, and they might end up quite dysregulated as well. So really sort of thinking about that, thinking about whether or not there are things that could be done to mitigate that, thinking about whether an online meeting is the best, you know, that actually the best option for that child is really important as well. I think that's fair to say, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. So during the meeting, recognize that many autistic people only show that they're autistic to people that they trust. You might not see certain autistic characteristics, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And this is something that we hear quite a lot with school meetings as well. Well, we don't see that at school. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Children can mask the fact that they're autistic quite skillfully from quite a young age. So just because you're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not happening as well. So do bear that in mind. And being aware of autistic fawning as well. And I do remember one situation where a child had been saying that, yes, they were fine whenever they were in school, but then melting down as soon as they came out of school, as soon as they got home and they were in a safe environment, and then telling family that they really didn't feel safe, that they didn't feel supported the way that they should do. And during a school meeting, the young person was brave enough to actually say how they truly felt, but it was negated by the education professionals in the room. So someone might be fawning whenever their safe person, their family, or, you know, a support worker from another place when they're not around, they might be phoning, but they might say something different whenever they feel as if they've got the support to say it. Okay. And what difference will that reasonable adjustment make? So if you come in 5 minutes earlier than everybody else, what difference is that going to make to you? And how will that benefit the school or the workplace? If you're able to use noise cancelling headphones, what difference will that reasonable adjustment make? So thinking about, why is it worth this place spending this money or making this adjustment or changing how they do things? So is it going to mean fewer meetings for them? Is it going to mean fewer meltdowns? Is it going to mean fewer shutdowns? Does it mean you're going to be more productive? So how is it going to benefit you and the place that you're negotiating the reasonable adjustments with? The Coke bottle effect is real. So if you imagine what it's like whenever you're an autistic person and you're on your way to school in the morning, for example, it might be traffic and you get held up with the roadworks. That shakes up the bottle a little bit. You get to school, your best friend is off at the dentist that morning. They're not there for you. That shakes up the bottle a little bit more. Somebody jostles into you whenever you're on your way up to the classroom. That jostles a little bit more. There's a surprise test, even more jostling. Your friend comes back at lunchtime from the dentist, and then you get dysregulated because that was good and you weren't expecting them. That jostles it even more. And all sorts of different things can happen. Miscommunications with people, unexpected sensory input, like the fire alarm going off, for example. All of these things, it's like taking that Coke bottle and shaking them up. And you keep a lid on all of these feelings because you have to sometimes whenever you're at school, or you feel like you have to. And then as soon as you come out, the lid comes off, and sometimes it's not just the lid goes off, but you chuck an entire packet of Mentos into that Coke bottle, and it does feel like an eruption afterwards. Now, again, schools might not see that, workplaces might not see that, but if somebody is reporting that they or their child is having a lot of meltdowns whenever they come back because of heavy masking, please do take that into account. That's really, really, really important. That you recognize that that's happening, and that you recognize that changes have to be made to your environment so that that Coke bottle effect isn't happening every single day, because the impact that that has on that person's quality of life cannot be overstated. It might prevent them from participating in after school clubs, going out and socializing with their friends, being able to take part in their hobbies, other things that everybody else would say would contribute to a good quality of life. Many parents of autistic children, I think you touched on this earlier, parents of autistic children might be autistic as well. Autism is highly genetic. We know that roughly 80% of autistic people have at least one other autistic family member, and a lot of the time that is a parent. Some teachers and other professionals might be autistic too. Now, no adult has to disclose that they are autistic in that environment. They don't have to. That is medical grade information, but it's just something that's really important to be aware of, that you don't know who else might be autistic in that room because you can't tell who's autistic just by looking at them. But again, no obligation to disclose. Make sure that if you are a professional in that meeting, that you're speaking clearly. Don't use jargon unless you're going to be explaining it, and ensure that you have sufficient time to explain any jargon. So if you're talking about GERFEC or Shinari or getting it right, then make sure that you're talking about what that is, where that's come from, what are the legal ramifications for this, how are you going and supporting it. And make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and clarification. And again, like Flip said, we shouldn't be asking for these as everybody is standing up and packing up their bags. That's not the time to ask if anybody's got any questions. It's well before we do that. It's asking if anybody's got any questions as you're going through the meeting, rather than just waiting until the end. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very, very fair. Okay, so we're continuing on during that meeting. It's really important to remember that sensory needs are real. Autistic people literally have brains that are structured differently from non-autistic people, and part of that means that we do have very different experiences of sensory input. We genuinely do. It's not something that we're imagining, and those needs don't diminish over time. So, you know, telling an employee that, well, you know, actually, no, we can't do anything about that sensory thing. You're just going to have to get used to it. You know, no, you can't wear earplugs in the office. I'm not sure about that. You'll just get used to the noise after a while. No, we're not going to get used to it, actually. And it doesn't matter how old we are either. We will still have those sensory needs. They are dynamic, though. Our needs are dynamic. They do change and fluctuate, and they're often influenced by many different factors, you know, by our hormonal changes. They can be influenced by how tired we are. They can be influenced by lots of different things, but that doesn't mean that they just magically go away at any point. Our environmental checklist that we have on the downloadable documents section of our information hub can provide really good guidance on ensuring that the environment is flexible and is likely to support a whole load of different needs as well. So we've got that tool that you can go and refer to, which can be really useful for sort of looking at how the environment is currently, thinking about what maybe good practice would be in terms of that environment, and there's space to write in what changes need to be made to make the environment more accessible as well. Now, stopping stimming, taking off ear defenders, increasing eye contact, these are things that should never be a goal for an autistic person. Doesn't matter whether they're a child or an adult, doesn't matter their age. This basically all means that you are forcing that autistic individual to mask their actual autistic identity and their autistic needs. And masking is linked in with a lot of really poor things in terms of it can damage our mental health. It can put us at greater risk of autistic burnout. So trying to force us to mask is not ethical, and it's not a goal that should ever be brought up in any of these meetings at any point. It's also really important to note that autistic social skills are valid. So we have over here on the left hand side of this slide, this is a picture that is taken from the Different Minds campaign that the Scottish Government were running as well, and that is Marion in cartoon form there, and aren't they adorable? So and all that entire video there is all about autistic social skills and how they're different but still very valid. So for one thing, you should be taking meaning from the words that we're actually using rather than inferring from tone of voice or body language or making assumptions based on kind of reading between the lines or anything. Literally listen to the words that are coming out of our mouth. That is how you know what we mean, not by whether we've got our arms crossed, because maybe that's actually because we needed some deep sensory input at the moment and it's got nothing to do with being defensive or anything like that, you know. Don't be looking at our facial expressions, because when we're concentrating, we might be frowning and that might be misinterpreted as us being combative or angry or defensive or something like that. So actually listen to those words that are coming out of our mouth. But also, it's important that if we're teaching autistic people about non-autistic social skills, which is valid, it can be really helpful for us to understand non-autistic social skills, to recognize them, and to realize what they mean. But if we're doing that, we should also at the same time, and this is where the video really comes into play, and I would encourage you to go and watch that on the Different Minds website, we should be teaching non-autistic people about autistic social skills, because we do have social skills and they are valid, and it's important actually that our peers understand those as well. So it's just important that everybody is understanding each other's communication style and social skills and recognizing that those may be different, but that doesn't mean that they're less valid actually. And spending time with other autistic people can help our confidence and allow them to socialize in a way which is natural to them. So because we have those different communication styles, because we have got that different social skills, often we find it much easier and much more validating when we're communicating with other autistic people, because they're using that same style as us. They have similar social skills, they have a similar lived experience. So recognizing that that can be hugely beneficial is really good, and facilitating that where possible as well is going to be a really good practice in general. Anything that I missed out from that one, Marion?
No, couldn't agree more with what you said. Okay. So this is a situation I've been in, and it's a really difficult one. But if someone says something that you believe to be untrue about autism or autistic people, what on earth do you do? And I really wish I'd had this list, to be perfectly honest. So here's what to do. Query where they got that information from. That's an interesting point that you've made. Can I ask where you got that information from? Or I'm not sure I quite agree with that. Can you tell me what your source is? It'd be a really good way of just sort of probing and getting, because if we know where they got that information from, then we've got more information to proceed on as well. So why do you disagree with it? What is your evidence? So in a meeting that I was in once, somebody told me that they believe that autistic people sometimes have meltdowns on purpose. So I know that that is not true. Having been a person who's had meltdowns for the last 45 years, there's not once I've ever had a meltdown on purpose. And having supported thousands of autistic people, I know that autistic people do not choose to have meltdowns at any point at all. And anyone who's had a meltdown would tell you that it's one of the most vulnerable times that you're ever going to be. You don't choose to do that. So what's their evidence? Why do they think that? So what sources have they been using? And then signpost to a better source of information if necessary. Why is this a better source? So is your source written by autistic people? Is it written by autistic autism professionals? Is it done in close collaboration with autistic people? Has it been an autistic-led piece of research? What makes your source of information a better source? Is it more up to date? Is their source of information somewhere that's based on studies from the 1980s? Because we know that a lot of people are still basing their understanding of autism based on research that was done in the 80s. Have they just not updated it yet? Is that what's going on? Have they not realized that research has moved on from there? Now, I understand that they were possibly taught this a long time ago, and they just maybe not be aware that things have moved on. I did my first training session in autism about 19 years ago, and the things I was told then are vastly different from my understanding of autism now. And to be honest, even 19 years ago, what I was first taught, I believe, was out of date. But I would sincerely hope that people wouldn't be getting taught the same kind of information back then. But given that there's not necessarily a requirement for someone to go and take on autism CPD training, it's possible that they were given a training session very, very long time ago and not had the opportunity to re-explore that area and update their practice accordingly. I recognise that it takes time for people to develop their understanding. If you've believed something about autistic people for 20 years, and then all of a sudden there's this person sat in front of you who's telling you that what you believe and how you've been practicing is not the case, that's going to take a little bit of time to undo that previous learning. Go ahead and look at the new learning that's available and update and then change your practice accordingly. Because if your practice has been that way for a very, very long time, it takes time to unpick that and undo that. So things might not change overnight. So it's not reasonable to expect that everything will change overnight, but it is reasonable to expect that things will change. If you're able to provide better sources, more up-to-date research, then it is reasonable to expect that people will change their practice based on those as well. Is that fair to say, Flick?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair to say.
Yeah.
Okay, so last one for during the meeting. This is just as we're finishing off the meeting. So before you do end, make sure that you talked about the autistic person's strengths and positive attributes, that this wasn't just some horrible list of all the ways in which they're struggling or failing, because nobody wants to go to a meeting where that happens. And as Marion said, we are more than the sum of our difficulties as well. So have you actually discussed their strengths? Have you looked at ways in which their strengths can be supported? Have you discussed the good things about them and what they're bringing to the company that they work for? Have you talked about the subjects they're doing really well at school? Because that's important too, actually. Has everybody had a chance to be heard as well? Have they had a chance to contribute to that meeting? You don't want to be coming out of a meeting and feeling like, well, I never actually got a chance to say the thing that I was going to be talking about. So yeah, making sure that everybody's been heard in that meeting. Has everybody agreed to the key points and actions? And have they actually agreed? Things didn't just get glossed over and sort of like, well, okay, right, well, we'll come back to that later. And so does everybody actually agree with what was discussed there? And especially if you are asking people to action a point, are they clear on what that is? Do they agree that that is their role to be going away and doing it? Do you know when the minutes are going to be distributed as well? It's really good to try and get them out as soon as possible after the meeting, before everybody's memory of what happened has got a bit fuzzy, so that everybody's memory is as accurate as possible. So if you can give people a kind of time scale for that, that can be really useful. Have you agreed to a next meeting as well? Because it can be tricky sort of sending everyone away and then trying to decide, oh, so when's the next meeting happening? And everybody's, sort of going, oh, well, I can't make that time and that day. And well, I can only do Tuesdays. And when everybody's in the room and you've all got your diaries there, maybe that's the best time to just get it in the diary so that you know that it's sorted and everybody's agreeing. But then also checking in with how everybody's actually feeling and how they're actually feeling, not how you're assuming that they're feeling as well, because we do know of people who have come away from meetings and it's been assumed by the boss there, by HR, by maybe the senior member of staff at the school, that, oh yeah, no, that went really well. But the autistic individual or the parent or someone has actually come out and cried. So have you checked in to make sure that everybody is actually okay following on from that meeting, and that you're not making any assumptions about the fact that, oh yeah, well, from my perspective, it went well. Does everybody feel like it went well? Does anybody need any extra support after the meeting? So yeah, that's an important one, isn't it?
Oh yeah, having been the autistic person who's left and cried, yes, I absolutely agree. That's a very, very important one. It can't be overstated again. Yeah. Don't make assumptions. And again, that's another point to remember is remember autistic masking and autistic phoning. Enthusiastic agreement is very different from reluctant agreement too.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've had the meeting. You're all done. It's all finished. Take time to process. Reasonable adjustment meetings can bring up an awful lot, especially if you're the person that they're talking about, because it's where you maybe don't meet up to their traditional expectations. Be a bit hard, and give yourself some self-care. Take some time to process that. If you were the person who took the minutes, make sure you send them out for agreement as soon as possible, so that people have got a proper time to reflect on them and come back with any amendments. And it really is okay to say that you disagree. It genuinely is. If for whatever reason you were at a meeting and they didn't take minutes, or they didn't take a very full minute, you can email for confirmation on key points. And what we found sometimes is that somebody will email with 5 points for confirmation, and then the reply that they get only maybe covers 3 or 4. And there's maybe 1 or 2 that doesn't get covered. In that instance, what we would recommend is send another email back saying, thank you for confirming those points. Can you confirm X, Y, and Z as well? Can you confirm the other things that have been? And make that the only ask in the email, so that it doesn't get buried in a list of other asks as well. So one email with that specific request for confirmation on that key point, and then wait until that comes in. And yeah, it's really okay to say that the minutes don't reflect your experiences of the meeting. It genuinely is. It's absolutely fair to say, I didn't say that, or that's not what I meant. I said X, I meant X, you inferred Y and Z. So as an autistic person, the words that I say, the words that come out of my mouth are the ones that I mean. I don't expect people to be inferring, but if they have inferred something from them that's not true, then you can ask them to change that. And again, ensure that you got the meeting for your date in the diary. So you might have decided on the date whenever you've been at the meeting, but if it's not on my calendar on the kitchen wall, if it's not written down in my paper calendar, and it's not in my phone calendar, it's not going to happen. It needs to be in all three of those places. If it's in all three of those places, guaranteed to happen. If it's missing one of them, then yeah, it's a bit more precarious. So make sure you got it written down everywhere. I tend to put on alarms so that I know on my phone calendar or my online calendar as well. So the next meeting, in 2 days' time, you've got this meeting. Okay, tomorrow, this meeting. Yeah, it's time to leave for this meeting. Have all those different alarms set on so then I don't forget. Plan in time to carry out any agreed upon actions. So if, for example, you have agreed that you are going to look into what pair of noise cancelling headphones would be good for you, make sure you've got time to do that in a timely manner. If you've agreed that you're going to be buying a pair of noise cancelling headphones, make sure you get that done sooner rather than later. The sooner you carry out that action, the more accessible that environment is going to be, the better for the autistic person. And again, the better for the autistic person, the better for everybody else around them as well. They'll be more happier, they'll be more productive, they'll be more relaxed, find it easier to access that environment. So you want to get that done as soon as humanly possible, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's key.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we do know that sometimes, you know, these meetings, you come away and you're quite disappointed from, you know, the outcome of it, and you don't feel like it's actually addressed your concerns, maybe that it didn't go how you were hoping. So what do you do if you're dissatisfied with the way the meeting went? Very first thing you should be doing is voicing those concerns, and ideally that should be with the people actually involved in the first instance. So, you know, going to them directly and trying to discuss with them why you're dissatisfied, see if there's a way that you can come to a resolution without escalating it, because that's going to save everyone involved a lot of time and energy and effort, and you know, that's the best course. That's the best sort of solution to come out of that. However, we also appreciate that sometimes you do that and best will in the world, you're still not getting anywhere. And you still need to escalate things further. So if after doing that you're still dissatisfied, then there are more things that you can do. So you can talk to your human resources department. If this is a work related thing, HR would be a good step. Union reps can be really helpful as well. If you're a member of a union and you've got a representative that you can go and speak to, they can be a really good shout as well with helping. ACAS can be a good one as well, so getting in touch with them can be a good step too. They've got a lot of good knowledge, and we've got the link down there at the bottom as well, so you can find them. If it's, you know, through a part of a school meeting, then sort of talking to the actual head teacher might be a next step. But yeah, if you just still feel like you're not getting anywhere with the school itself, quality improvement officer, QIO, for your local authority for the area that your school falls under, can be next step as well. Sometimes you might need to actually go and seek external mediation, because maybe relationship is just broken down there actually, and nothing productive is happening in conversations with the people involved. So you need someone else to be kind of coming in from outside to actually act as a mediator as well. So that can be a good next step too. Or maybe bringing in other outside professionals as well. So potentially someone from CAMHS, so that's Children and Adolescents Mental Health Services, SALT, so speech and language therapists, mental health professionals, an advocate like we mentioned earlier. So it might be that there's somebody else as well who can provide evidence, to back up what it is that you're asking for. Unfortunately, that maybe the people involved will listen to a bit better, sadly, than you, or as well. So yeah, it might be that you need to kind of get that backup from an outside professional. But there are also formal routes that you can take. A lot of the time, this will be something that you'll need to look into yourself, because that kind of thing can vary quite a lot depending on the actual local authority that you're in. So there's not necessarily one standard approach. So you need to go and check out what that route is going to be for you in your area. And it might be as well that you end up needing to go to an additional needs support tribunal too. So you do have that option if things kind of really do escalate that far. So getting some good information on this, you can go to Enquire. So they're really good at sort of looking at children and young people's rights, and you can contact them via phone, but they do also have an online option as well. If you're not needing to hear back from them immediately and you've got a bit of time, then you can send an email and they will get back to you within a certain time frame. I've used that option before and they were really, really good, gave very thorough answer to my question. And like I mentioned earlier as well, ACAS can be a really good shout as well if you're kind of struggling in a work situation too. So yeah, we've got those clicky links there as well that you should be able to get to on the slides. Anything you'd add to that one, Marion?
No, I have to say I really like the ACAS stuff on neurodiversity and neurodivergence. I think they did actually a pretty decent job on those. So yeah, well worth checking out. Okay, we have an entire list of useful links. So for those people who are who were signed up and getting access to the slides, so the AU SCOT website, the Different Minds, NHS Inform, UNCRPD, the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Equality Act legislation, the Enquire, Govern Law as well. That's another place that can be really supportive for families. And My Rights, My Say, which is an organisation that supports autistic people from the ages of 12 to 15. And we've heard some really, really great things about them. Right. But some sort of key takeaways that we've got here. Being autistic, it does mean that we've got a slightly significantly kind of different brain. So our brain doesn't work in the same way as everybody else. So we need reasonable adjustments to accommodate for that. We have our own accommodation, our own communication style. And again, reasonable adjustments should be put into place to support our communication style. And that includes during reasonable adjustment meetings. So understanding autistic communication really, really matters during these meetings. And remember, we all have a responsibility for being understood during these meetings. So it shouldn't be that the autistic person has to make sure that they're understanding and following the non-autistic people in the meeting. Non-autistic people have a responsibility to make sure that they are being understood properly by autistics, and vice versa. We all have a responsibility to making sure that we are being understood in these meetings. Reasonable adjustments are an autistic right. And so we've seen that it is enshrined in legislation. So it's not something that would be nice for us to have. It's not something that would be good where it's convenient. It is an actual legal right for us to have these reasonable adjustments. And I'm hoping that you could see from some of the example reasonable adjustments that we've suggested, many reasonable adjustments can be very easy to implement. It doesn't take a lot of time or a lot of thought or money to be putting a lot of these reasonable adjustments into place. It's just having that little bit of consideration and making sure that you're regularly checking in with the autistic person to make sure that those reasonable adjustments are working for them. So I think we've come to the end of our webinar. We hope that you've enjoyed it and that you've got an awful lot out of it. Please let us know if this information has been really useful for you. And thank you for bearing with us to the end.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.